Society constantly praises your fierce independence. They call you highly capable. They admire your low-maintenance nature. They label this exact behavioral pattern as maturity. They are completely and objectively wrong. Your exceptional competence is not a personality trait. It is a profound neurological scar. You never actually grew up fast. You simply bypassed the developmental stage of childhood entirely. Your environment fundamentally failed you. It lacked the basic biological prerequisite for human development. You were provided absolutely no physical or emotional barrier against the world. But here is the brutal physical reality. A 7-year-old child sits in the back seat of a moving vehicle. They do not look out the window. They do not engage in any form of play. Their eyes remain permanently locked on the rearview mirror. They are actively tracking a specific moving target. They monitor the subtle, millimeter-level tightening of their parents' jaw muscles. They consciously restrict the movement of their own diaphragm. They force their breathing to achieve absolute, undetectable silence. Their brain rapidly scans recent memory files. They systematically review any minor action that could be perceived as a mistake. They draft and memorize a precise, preemptive apology. They are actively diffusing a violent emotional explosion that has not even occurred yet. When exactly did your hypervigilance start masquerading as responsibility? An external protector was biologically required for your survival. That protector was entirely absent. It was replaced by a relentless, self-generated threat detection algorithm. What actually happens to the physical architecture of a human nervous system under these exact conditions? Unprotected children never actually learn how to be safe. They learn how to systematically micromanage danger. An external guardian was biologically scheduled to arrive. It never showed up. Your brain was forced to build a replacement. It constructed a hyper-active, self-generated biological alarm system. The actual fatal mechanism starts in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. An external buffer is required to regulate infant stress. The absence of this buffer forces the HPA axis into chronic activation. Your biological baseline is permanently altered. Your bloodstream is continuously flooded with toxic levels of cortisol. Adrenaline becomes your default physiological fuel. This chemical assault actively changes the physical architecture of your brain. The amygdala undergoes forced, rapid enlargement. Its sole function becomes aggressive threat detection. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex is severely inhibited. It loses the biological capacity to signal safety to the rest of the body. Your brain becomes physically incapable of registering peace, but the physical reality is even more severe. Evolutionary psychology defines this as a fast life history strategy. Parental investment is functionally absent from your environment. The developing organism registers this absence as an immediate survival threat. It unconsciously adopts a rapid developmental protocol. Your brain aggressively accelerates executive functioning. It prioritizes complex planning and threat anticipation. This acceleration comes at a devastating biological cost. The neural pathways dedicated to play are permanently pruned. Exploration is neurologically coded as an unnecessary risk. Neuroplasticity is sacrificed for immediate tactical survival. The child unconsciously morphs into a human environmental stabilizer. You learned a brutal mathematical equation very early on. Your immediate physical safety was not a given right. It was directly correlated with your performance. You had to perfectly regulate the volatile emotional states of the adults in the room. Failure to stabilize them meant immediate physical or psychological danger. You became a master manipulator of external moods to stay alive. Watch close how they react in ordinary settings. An adult attends a casual dinner party with friends. Others are passively consuming food and engaging in relaxed conversation. This individual is actively running a complex threat assessment protocol. They continuously track the decibel level of the entire room. They monitor the host's facial muscles for microscopic signs of irritation. They mathematically calculate the fluid levels in everyone's glasses. They intercept and forcefully steer conversations away from unpredictable debates. Their physical posture remains locked in absolute rigidity. Their eyes systematically dart across the room on a set interval. They are desperately orchestrating the room's psychological stability. Their taste buds are functionally deactivated by stress hormones. They are entirely incapable of experiencing the taste of their own meal. The inevitable result is a devastating accumulation of allostatic load. Your sympathetic nervous system is trapped in chronic overdrive for decades. This directly forces a catastrophic somatic breakdown in adulthood. It physically manifests as paralyzing chronic fatigue. It triggers aggressive, unexplainable autoimmune flare-ups. It destroys the gastrointestinal tract. It guarantees severe, irreversible physiological burnout. You successfully survived by controlling your external environment to absolute perfection. But maintaining this environmental control requires an impossible amount of metabolic energy, and it gets worse. What happens when this ruthless, militarized efficiency is suddenly turned inward? What happens when it targets your own emotional biology? For the unprotected mind, emotions are never processed as shared human experiences. They are registered strictly as logistical vulnerabilities. They represent a direct threat to biological survival. They must be immediately and ruthlessly neutralized. The actual fatal mechanism begins in the earlier stages of infancy. The infant biologically requires external regulation from a caregiver. They initiate proximity, seeking behaviors to survive. They cry loudly to signal physical distress. They display visible fear to elicit a protective response. The environment completely fails to provide this biological regulation. The infant's nervous system logs this physical failure as a mathematical certainty. Expenditure of energy on emotional signaling yields zero return. The brain adapts by systematically deactivating the attachment system entirely. It forcefully shuts down the biological drive to seek human comfort. This drastic neurochemical intervention conserves critical metabolic energy. It clinically prevents the recurring psychological trauma of abandonment. This biological shutdown directly triggers the development of Alexithymia. The individual loses the neurological capacity to identify their own feelings. They become fundamentally unable to describe internal states to themselves. Historically, expressing distress provided absolutely zero environmental advantage. It often actively provoked unpredictable physical or emotional punishment. The brain responds by severing the connection between feeling and cognition. It stops consciously labeling internal emotional data. A severe spike in sadness is no longer processed as an emotion. It is purely registered as a sudden, sharp pain in the chest cavity. Deep psychological panic is misclassified as standard gastrointestinal distress. The individual becomes a stranger to their own internal physiology. They perceive their own emotional reactions strictly as physical illnesses, and it gets worse when we examine the vagus nerve. This critical nerve controls the parasympathetic state. It is the biological hardware required for human social engagement. In the unprotected child, this nerve remains severely physically underdeveloped. The neural pathways required for spontaneous social connection are never built. The nervous system completely bypasses the social engagement protocol. It permanently defaults to a highly mobilized fight or flight state. When overwhelmed, it drops directly into a paralyzed freeze response. There is no biological middle ground for calm, relaxed interaction. The physical hardware required to feel safe around other humans simply does not exist. Watch close how they react under acute, catastrophic stress. An individual receives a phone call delivering devastating personal news. They are informed of a sudden, irreversible job termination. They listen to the spoken words. They quietly disconnect the call. Their facial musculature remains entirely paralyzed and blank. Their internal heart rate instantly spikes to 140 beats per minute. They immediately stand up and walk to a locking bathroom. They physically isolate themselves behind a solid wooden door. They place a laptop on a flat surface. They open a blank, multi-tab financial spreadsheet. They begin drafting a precise 10-step economic mitigation protocol. Their hands begin to physically shake from the massive adrenaline dump. They consciously flex their forearms to suppress the muscular tremors. They force their vocal cords to remain entirely inactive. They ensure absolute dead silence in the room. The consequence is a profound biological inability to co-regulate. They treat their own intense emotions as toxic, hazardous waste. This physiological waste must be processed entirely in solitary confinement. They successfully construct an impenetrable, trauma-informed psychological fortress. This architecture literally starves them of the basic biological need for human connection. This extreme emotional self-containment makes you a bulletproof asset in a disaster. You become an exceptionally efficient worker during a crisis. But this precise survival mechanism creates a fatal, unresolvable paradox. What happens when this mechanical nervous system attempts to experience human intimacy? The unprotected adult physically cannot process love as a baseline reality. They perceive affection strictly as a ruthless economic transaction. Safety is never freely given in their environment. It must be continuously purchased through relentless utility and strict compliance. The actual fatal mechanism begins with the total invalidation of the developing child. A healthy nervous system requires a protector to mirror its emotional state. This biological feedback loop was completely absent in your early environment. The child's authentic psychological core is forcefully driven into hiding to survive. The brain immediately begins constructing a highly adaptive false self architecture. This false self operates like a sophisticated, real-time scanning program. Its primary directive is to continuously read the psychological climate of the room. It forcefully alters the individual's outward personality without conscious permission. It calculates exactly what behavior will be most useful to the current authority figure. It instantly morphs into whatever persona guarantees the lowest probability of conflict. But here is the brutal physical reality of your neurochemistry. Your brain's fundamental reward pathways have been completely and physically routed. A typical brain releases oxytocin during moments of passive, safe connection. Your brain actively suppresses the release of this specific bonding hormone. It registers passive connection as a dangerous, highly vulnerable lack of control. Instead, your nervous system runs almost exclusively on dopamine. This dopamine is only released when you successfully execute an act of service. You only experience a chemical reward when you solve a complex problem for someone else. Your subconscious mind mathematically equates your biological right to exist with your immediate utility. If you are not actively producing a tangible solution, you register as biologically worthless, and it gets worse. This exact neurological programming creates a devastating repetition compulsion. The subconscious mind possesses a relentless mechanical drive to recreate early childhood dynamics. It forces the adult to chronically gravitate toward emotionally unavailable partners. It actively seeks out highly chaotic or unpredictable relationship environments. The brain recognizes this specific environmental chaos as its natural biological habitat. It attempts to finally secure the physical protection it was historically denied. It deploys its extreme competence to aggressively stabilize the unstable partner. It treats the romantic relationship as an active, high-stakes logistical mission. You are attempting to retroactively save your childhood self by continuously saving them. Watch close how they react to unconditional care. A romantic partner notices the individual is physically exhausted. The partner gently offers to cook dinner and tells them to rest on the couch. The unprotected adult's somatic nervous system instantly detects a severe survival threat. Their skeletal muscles immediately stiffen into a rigid, defensive posture. Their diaphragm locks, forcing their breathing to become rapid and incredibly shallow. They find it physically impossible to remain seated in a relaxed position. They instinctively stand up and track the partner into the kitchen space. They hover uncomfortably, monitoring the cooking process. They aggressively offer to chop vegetables or immediately clean the countertops. They suddenly manufacture an urgent work email that requires immediate attention. They experience acute, paralyzing physical anxiety in their chest cavity. Receiving unearned care violently violates their core biological survival algorithm. The consequence is a continuous, violent push-pull dynamic in all adult relationships. They desperately crave emotional closeness on a conscious cognitive level, but the moment a partner attempts to provide actual unconditional care, their biology rejects it. The absence of a specific transactional role signals a terrifying loss of environmental control. You can outwork and outplan every single threat in your external environment. You can outperform your own trauma for decades, but eventually you might actually succeed in building a physically safe life, and that is precisely when the true biological collapse begins. The unprotected nervous system completely lacks the bandwidth to process trauma in real time. It strictly prioritizes immediate physical survival over emotional digestion. Grief requires immense metabolic energy to fully process. Your body aggressively diverted all available energy to continuous threat detection. It actively blocked the processing of historical pain to keep you functional. But this unprocessed biological data does not simply disappear. It is violently compressed and stored in the deep physical tissues. The brain actively waits for a specific environmental trigger. It requires absolute, objective, uninterrupted physical safety. Only then will it initiate a catastrophic biological release. The actual fatal mechanism is a massive parasympathetic rebound. Your sympathetic nervous system operated in chronic arousal for decades. It continuously pumped adrenaline to keep you heavily armored. Then your external environment finally reaches a state of stability. You secure a safe job and a non-abusive living space. The biological threat scanner detects zero immediate physical danger. The parasympathetic nervous system violently overcompensates in response. It slams the physiological brakes on your entire body. It forcefully drops your heart rate and muscle tension to zero. It initiates a total, non-negotiable physiological shutdown. Your body aggressively demands the cellular rest it was historically denied. And it gets worse inside the brain's memory centers. Traumatic memory is never stored as a coherent narrative. It is stored implicitly as fragmented sensory data in the amygdala. It exists purely as trapped physical tension and sharp chemical spikes, achieving external safety signals the hippocampus to begin integration. The hippocampus starts the metabolically expensive work of organizing this data. It forcefully converts raw sensory fragments into explicit, chronological memories. This sudden neurochemical transfer overwhelms the conscious mind. The brain is flooded with decades of suppressed terror simultaneously. This rigorous biological integration process physically feels like a complete mental breakdown. You also hit the absolute biological limit of ego depletion. You spent a lifetime carrying a relentless, invisible cognitive load. Your brain constantly scanned for threats and managed your environment. It actively suppressed thousands of natural emotional responses every single day. This constant self-monitoring requires massive amounts of glucose in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex finally exhausts its regulatory capacity entirely. The neurological battery that powered your extreme competence simply dies. Your executive functioning temporarily goes offline. You lose the physical ability to suppress your internal state. The highly sophisticated survival architecture completely collapses under its own weight. Watch close how they react when the war is finally over. An individual has secured a completely safe, stable existence. They possess a reliable income and a deeply loving spouse. It is a quiet, entirely threat-free Sunday morning. They accidentally drop a single piece of toast onto the kitchen floor. Their knees instantly buckle under their own physical weight. They collapse straight down onto the cold linoleum surface. They begin sobbing violently, completely unable to control their diaphragm. They cannot physically stand back up. They cannot articulate any logical reason for their severe crying. A profound, paralyzing heaviness heavily anchors their limbs to the floor. They remain physically incapable of executing basic daily tasks for weeks. The immediate medical consequence is a devastating false diagnosis. The individual firmly believes they are experiencing severe psychological regression. They logically conclude they are rapidly losing their mind. They mistake this necessary physiological shutdown for clinical depression. They aggressively judge themselves for falling apart during peacetime. They fail to recognize the brutal mechanics of their own biology. This absolute physical collapse is not a system malfunction. It is the mandatory biological prerequisite for deep emotional integration. The body must break the mechanical suit to save the human inside. This terrifying somatic collapse is not the end of your functional strength. It is the agonizing, required death of your outdated survival mechanism. It violently clears the neurological ground for an actual life. Look at your entire life through a strictly objective, clinical lens. Your fierce, celebrated independence is absolutely not a virtue. It is a textbook physiological symptom of early environmental failure. You are not a highly functioning, naturally resilient adult. You are a profoundly traumatized child. You are currently operating a highly sophisticated, deeply exhausting biological mech suit. You have spent your entire conscious existence believing a specific mathematical lie. You firmly calculate that if you drop the cognitive weight, the physical world will crush you. You believe your constant vigilance is the only gravity keeping your life intact. But here is the brutal physical reality. Nobody in your current environment is asking you to carry it anymore. The biological and psychological war of your childhood is definitively over. You successfully survived the hostile environment, but you are aggressively continuing to wear heavy tactical armor in peacetime. You are the exact entity currently suffocating your own biology. Society fundamentally mislabeled your condition for decades. True neurological maturity is never the ability to withstand infinite isolation. It is the biological courage to tolerate a specific, terrifying physiological state. It is the capacity to withstand the agonizing vulnerability of human dependence. Do not attempt to use logic to override a deeply ingrained physiological response. Your prefrontal cortex cannot simply out. Think a chronically activated amygdala. Watch close how you react when another human explicitly offers you assistance. Do not immediately and reflexively deploy your rejection algorithm. Force your physical body to pause for exactly 3 seconds. Direct your cognitive attention to the rising physical heat in your chest cavity. Mathematically track the sudden, sharp tension locking your jaw muscles. Identify this specific somatic data for exactly what it is. It is purely a mechanical, outdated survival reflex firing in the nervous system. It completely lacks any factual basis in your current physical reality. You must immediately begin a protocol of micro-dosing biological surrender. Select exactly one minor, mathematically low, stakes task this week. Delegate this specific task entirely to another capable human being. Allow a romantic partner to dictate the exact physical route of a drive. Permit a colleague to finalize the structural formatting of a standard document. You must physically stop your hands from intervening. Absolutely, do not check their completed work for errors. You must aggressively force your nervous system to remain online. Make it biologically withstand the temporary, acute physical anxiety of non-control. You are actively teaching your brain a new mathematical reality. Environmental imperfection does not automatically equal biological death. Your extreme survival mechanics successfully kept your physical body breathing. But mere cellular respiration is not the biological equivalent of a human life. Understanding the strict objective mechanics of your own mind is mandatory. It will literally teach your nervous system how to safely exist. You must demand the brutal clinical truth about human psychology. You must forcefully strip away all comforting societal illusions. If you require this exact level of rigorous psychological unmasking, hit subscribe. We permanently rely on clinical data. We completely reject emotional delusions. See you in the next deep dive.